desperate father, a mother on the edge. In a land where survival demands sacrifice, a Blackfoot warrior makes a haunting request of a frontier widow. Your son must hunt soon, my daughter hungers tonight. But what happens when the line between enemy and ally begins to blur? Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you like the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The autumn wind swept across the Montana wilderness, carrying with it the sharp scent of pine and the promise of an early winter. The year was 1863, and the frontier stretched endlessly beneath a sky painted in shades of amber and violet as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Rocky Mountains. In this vast and unforgiving land, survival was not merely a matter of skill, but of will, a daily negotiation with nature that left no room for weakness or hesitation. Margaret Ellen Whitmore stood at the edge of her modest homestead, her hazel eyes scanning the tree line, with the practiced vigilance of someone who had learned to read the wilderness, like others read books. At 24 years of age, she possessed a beauty that seemed almost defiant in its resilience, her auburn hair catching the dying light like strands of copper fire, her features delicate yet hardened by 3 years of frontier living. Her hands, once soft and suited for piano keys and embroidery, now bore the calluses of chopping wood, tanning hides, and gripping rifle stocks. The cabin behind her was a testament to her determination, built by her late husband Thomas before the fever had claimed him 2 winters past. She had refused to abandon it, refused to return to the comfortable life in Boston that her family had begged her to resume. This land, harsh as it was, had become her home, and she would not surrender it to grief or fear. Her son Benjamin emerged from the cabin, his 12-year-old frame already showing the promise of the man he would become. He had his father's dark hair and his mother's stubborn chin, and in his hands he carried the hunting rifle that had once belonged to Thomas Whitmore. "Mama, I checked the snares like you asked," Benjamin said, his voice carrying the slight tremor of disappointment. Nothing but a single rabbit, and it was small. Margaret turned to face her son, forcing a reassuring smile despite the worry that gnawed at her heart. The hunting had been poor for weeks now. The game seemingly vanished from the surrounding woods as if warned away by some unseen force. Their stores were dwindling faster than she had anticipated, and the winter that approached showed no signs of mercy. "A rabbit is better than nothing, Benjamin," she replied, resting her hand on his shoulder. "We will make it last. We always do." But even as she spoke the words, Margaret knew they rang hollow. The truth was that their situation had grown desperate, and she had begun to contemplate the unthinkable, the possibility of leaving the homestead and seeking refuge in one of the distant settlements before the snows made travel impossible. The thought filled her with a profound sense of failure, as if abandoning this place would mean abandoning Thomas's memory and everything they had built together. "I could go further into the mountains tomorrow," Benjamin offered, his young face set with determination that both warmed and frightened his mother. "There must be deer up there or elk. I am a good shot now, Mama. Father taught me well." Margaret studied her son, seeing in his eyes the same fierce independence that had driven Thomas to carve a life from this wilderness. She wanted to refuse, to keep him close where she could protect him, but she also recognized that coddling him would do neither of them any favors. The frontier demanded strength, and Benjamin would need to learn that strength sooner rather than later. "We will discuss it in the morning," she said finally. "For now, help me secure the animals for the night. I do not like the feel of the air. A storm may be coming." They worked together in the fading light, ensuring that the 2 remaining chickens were safely cooped, and that the old mare, Bessie, had fresh water and hay in the small stable Thomas had constructed. The routine was familiar and comforting, a series of tasks that connected Margaret to the rhythms of the land and reminded her why she had chosen to stay. As darkness settled over the homestead, Margaret prepared a simple meal of rabbit stew, stretching the meager meat with wild onions and the last of their stored potatoes. Benjamin ate hungrily, his growing body demanding more sustenance than she could consistently provide. She watched him with a mixture of love and concern, silently calculating how many more days their supplies might last. "Mama," Benjamin said between bites, "do you ever think about what Father used to say about the Indians?" The question caught Margaret off guard, and she set down her spoon carefully before responding. "What do you mean?" "He used to say that we were all strangers in this land, and that the Indians knew it better than we ever could. He said that if we respected them, they might teach us things that could save our lives someday." Margaret nodded slowly, remembering Thomas's words and the conviction with which he had spoken them. Unlike many settlers who viewed the native peoples with suspicion and hostility, Thomas had approached them with curiosity and respect. He had even traded with them on occasion, exchanging tools and supplies for furs and knowledge about the local terrain. "Your father was a wise man," she said softly. "He understood that survival out here requires more than just strength. It requires humility and the willingness to learn from those who came before us." "Do you think we will ever meet them?" Benjamin asked. "The Indians, I mean. The Blackfoot tribe that father used to trade with?" Before Margaret could answer, a sound from outside froze the words in her throat. It was subtle, barely audible above the crackling of the fire, but her instincts recognized it immediately. Someone was approaching the cabin. She rose silently, gesturing for Benjamin to remain seated as she retrieved the rifle from its place above the door. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she moved to the window, peering through the small gap in the shutters at the darkness beyond. At first, she saw nothing but shadows. Then, emerging from the tree line like a phantom summoned by her son's words, a figure appeared. He walked with deliberate slowness, his hands raised and empty in the universal gesture of peaceful intent. Behind him, barely visible in the moonlight, Margaret could make out a second, smaller figure moving with obvious difficulty. "Benjamin, stay inside," she commanded, her voice steady despite her fear. She opened the door just enough to slip through, keeping the rifle raised and ready as she faced the approaching stranger. He stopped about 20 feet from the cabin, allowing her to see him clearly in the silver light. He was tall and powerfully built, his frame speaking of years spent hunting and fighting in this harsh wilderness. His face was striking in its intensity, with high cheekbones, a strong jaw, and eyes so dark they seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. His black hair was long, adorned with feathers and beads that marked him as a warrior of considerable standing. Despite the cold, he wore only a leather vest over his bare chest, revealing arms corded with muscle and marked with ceremonial scars. "I come in peace," he said, his English heavily accented but understandable. "I am Running Wolf of the Blackfoot people. I seek help for my daughter." Margaret's finger hovered over the trigger, every lesson she had learned about frontier survival screaming at her to send this man away. But something in his voice, a note of desperation that she recognized all too well, made her hesitate. "What kind of help?" she demanded, not lowering the rifle. Running Wolf gestured behind him, and the smaller figure stumbled forward into the light. It was a girl of perhaps 14 or 15 winters, her face pale and drawn with pain. She clutched her side, and even from this distance, Margaret could see the dark stain of blood spreading beneath her fingers. "My daughter Morning Star was injured in a hunting accident," Running Wolf explained, his voice tight with barely contained anguish. "The wound has become poisoned. Our medicine man could not save her. I have heard that the white woman who lives alone knows the healing arts. I have come to beg for her help." Margaret stared at the injured girl, her maternal instincts warring with her caution. She had indeed learned some medicine from her mother, who had been a midwife in Boston, and she had used that knowledge to treat various ailments and injuries over the years. But treating a stranger, a native stranger, carried risks that she could not ignore. "Why should I help you?" she asked, the question coming out harsher than she intended. "Your people and mine have not always been friends." Running Wolf met her gaze without flinching, and in his dark eyes she saw something that surprised her. Respect. "Your husband traded fairly with my people. He did not cheat us or treat us as lesser beings. When he died, we mourned him as we would mourn one of our own. I ask for help not as a stranger, but as one who remembers Thomas Whitmore with honor." The mention of Thomas's name sent a jolt through Margaret's heart. She had not known that her husband's reputation had spread to the native tribes, or that they had honored his memory in such a way. The revelation softened something within her, cracking the wall of suspicion that she had erected around herself. "Bring her inside," she heard herself say, lowering the rifle. "Quickly, before she loses more blood." Running Wolf's expression shifted, the hard mask of the warrior giving way to something raw and grateful. He moved swiftly to his daughter's side, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all, and carried her toward the cabin. Benjamin had opened the door, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and fascination as the Blackfoot warrior entered their home. Margaret directed Running Wolf to lay Morning Star on the small bed in the corner, then set about gathering the supplies she would need: clean cloths, hot water, the poultice she had prepared for such emergencies, and the precious bottle of whiskey she kept for medicinal purposes. As she worked to clean and examine the wound, Margaret was acutely aware of Running Wolf's presence. He stood watch over his daughter like a guardian spirit, his dark eyes following Margaret's every movement with an intensity that should have unnerved her, but somehow did not. "The infection has spread," Margaret said grimly, examining the angry red lines radiating from the gash in Morning Star's side. "I will do what I can, but she needs rest and proper care. It will take time." "Time is something we do not have," Running Wolf replied, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. "Winter comes early this year. My people must move to our winter camp within days. If Morning Star cannot travel, she will be left behind." Margaret looked up sharply, horror evident in her eyes. "You would abandon your own daughter?" "It is not abandonment," he said, though the words seemed to cause him physical pain. "It is the way of our people. The tribe must survive. One life cannot endanger many." "That is barbaric," Margaret snapped before she could stop herself. Running Wolf's jaw tightened, but he did not respond with anger. Instead, he moved closer, his presence filling the small cabin like a force of nature. "You judge what you do not understand. I love my daughter more than my own life, but I am also responsible for my people. That is the burden of leadership." Margaret held his gaze, seeing in those dark depths a conflict as deep and painful as any she had ever witnessed. This man was not the savage she had been warned about. He was a father, a leader, a human being caught between duty and love. "She cannot be moved for at least a week," Margaret said firmly. "Perhaps longer. If you leave her here, I will care for her until she is well enough to travel." Running Wolf studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Why would you do this? You owe us nothing." "Because it is the right thing to do," Margaret replied simply. "And because my husband would have done the same." Something shifted in Running Wolf's eyes, a flicker of emotion that was gone almost before Margaret could identify it. He nodded slowly, then reached into the pouch at his belt and withdrew a small, intricately carved wooden pendant on a leather cord. "This belonged to my wife," he said, pressing it into Margaret's hand. "She died giving birth to Morning Star. It is the most precious thing I own. I give it to you as a promise. I will return for my daughter, and when I do, I will repay your kindness in whatever way you ask." Margaret looked down at the pendant, feeling the weight of its meaning in her palm. "I do not need payment for doing what is right." "Nevertheless," Running Wolf said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "you will have it." He turned to his daughter, leaning down to whisper something in their native tongue. Morning Star, despite her pain and fever, managed a weak smile and reached up to touch her father's face. The tenderness of the moment made Margaret's heart ache with recognition. Here was a love as fierce and pure as her own love for Benjamin. Running Wolf straightened, composing himself once more into the formidable warrior he presented to the world. "Your son," he said, turning to look at Benjamin, who had been watching the scene with rapt attention. "He carries a hunter's rifle but moves like one who has not yet learned to hunt." Benjamin flushed with embarrassment, but Margaret felt a spark of defensive anger. "He is learning," she said sharply. "His father taught him before he died." "Learning is not enough," Running Wolf replied, his tone matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "Winter is coming and your stores are low. I can see it in the thinness of your faces and the worry in your eyes." He paused, his gaze moving from Benjamin to Margaret and back again. "Your son must hunt soon. My daughter hungers tonight. Perhaps these two needs can serve each other." Margaret frowned, not understanding. "What do you mean?" "I will teach your son to hunt as the Blackfoot hunt," Running Wolf said. "In return, you will heal my daughter and provide her with food until she is strong again. It is a fair trade, is it not?" The offer hung in the air between them, laden with implications that Margaret could barely begin to process. To accept would mean allowing this warrior, this stranger, into their lives in a way that went far beyond a simple act of charity. It would mean trusting him with her son's safety and well-being. But as she looked at Benjamin's eager face and thought of the empty snares and dwindling supplies, Margaret knew that she had no real choice. Pride and caution were luxuries she could no longer afford. "When would you begin?" she asked. Running Wolf allowed himself the ghost of a smile, the first Margaret had seen on his stern face. "Tomorrow, at first light. Your son and I will hunt together. By the time my daughter is well, he will be able to provide for you both through the hardest winter." He moved toward the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at Margaret. Their eyes met, and in that moment, something passed between them that neither could name but both could feel. It was the beginning of something, though whether that something would prove to be salvation or catastrophe, only time would tell. "Until tomorrow, Margaret Whitmore," Running Wolf said, using her full name for the first time. Then he was gone, disappearing into the night as silently as he had come. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring after him. Behind her, Morning Star had fallen into a restless sleep, and Benjamin was already asking questions that she could not answer. The wind had picked up, carrying the promise of change on its icy breath. She did not know it then, but the arrival of Running Wolf and his daughter had set in motion a chain of events that would transform her life in ways she could never have imagined. The frontier was about to reveal its deepest secrets, and Margaret Whitmore would discover that the heart, like the wilderness, was vast enough to hold both sorrow and joy, loss and love. As she closed the door against the cold, Margaret touched the wooden pendant that still rested in her palm. It was warm, as if it still held the heat of Running Wolf's hand, and somehow that warmth seemed to seep into her very soul. The first light of dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the sky in delicate shades of rose and gold, as Margaret Whitmore stirred from her restless sleep. She had spent most of the night tending to Morning Star, changing her bandages and coaxing sips of water between her fevered lips. The girl's condition remained precarious, the infection fighting against the poultices and herbal remedies that Margaret applied with careful precision. She rose quietly from the chair beside the bed, her body stiff and aching from the uncomfortable position in which she had dozed. Benjamin still slept on his pallet near the fireplace, his young face peaceful in repose, and Margaret allowed herself a moment to simply watch him breathe. In sleep, he looked so much like Thomas that her heart contracted with a familiar ache. The sound of movement outside drew her attention to the window. Through the frost-edged glass, she could see Running Wolf emerging from the tree line, moving with the silent grace of a predator, despite carrying what appeared to be 2 freshly caught rabbits. He had spent the night in the wilderness, she realized, watching over the cabin from a distance rather than abandoning his daughter entirely. Margaret opened the door before he could knock, and their eyes met in the gray morning light. He looked different somehow, less like the intimidating warrior who had appeared out of the darkness, and more like a man who had spent a sleepless night worrying about his child. "How is she?" he asked without preamble. "The fever has not broken," Margaret replied honestly. "But she is fighting. She has her father's strength, I think." Something flickered in Running Wolf's dark eyes, an emotion too complex to name. He held out the rabbits toward her, and Margaret noticed for the first time the intricate beadwork on his leather cuffs, the careful artistry that spoke of a culture far richer than the savage wilderness the settlers imagined. "For your table," he said, "and for Morning Star when she is well enough to eat." Margaret accepted the offering, feeling the weight of more than just the rabbits in her hands. "Thank you. I will prepare them for our meal tonight. First we hunt," Running Wolf reminded her. "Wake your son, the deer move at dawn, and we must be in position before the sun rises fully." Margaret hesitated, the protective instinct of a mother warring with the practical necessity of the situation. But she had made an agreement, and she would honor it. She nodded and turned back into the cabin, gently shaking Benjamin awake. The boy's eyes flew open instantly, alert and eager in a way that made Margaret smile despite her worry. He had barely slept himself, too excited about the prospect of hunting with a real Blackfoot warrior to find rest easily. "Is it time?" Benjamin asked, already reaching for his boots. "It is time," Margaret confirmed. "Dress warmly and eat something quickly. Running Wolf is waiting." She watched as her son scrambled to prepare himself, his movements clumsy with excitement. When he emerged from the cabin moments later, rifle in hand and determination in his eyes, Margaret felt a complex mixture of pride and fear swelling in her chest. Running Wolf studied the boy with an appraising gaze, taking in his posture, his grip on the rifle, the way he held himself. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him, for he gave a slight nod and gestured toward the forest. "We go north, toward the high meadows," he said. "There is a herd of deer that feeds there in the mornings. But first you must learn to walk." Benjamin frowned in confusion. "I already know how to walk." "You know how to walk like a white man," Running Wolf corrected, a hint of amusement in his otherwise stern voice. "Loud and careless, announcing your presence to every creature within a mile. Today you will learn to walk like a hunter." They set off into the forest, and Margaret watched them until the trees swallowed them from view. Then she turned back to the cabin and the sick girl who needed her care, trying to ignore the anxiety that twisted in her stomach. Inside, Morning Star had awakened, her dark eyes glazed with fever but aware. She watched Margaret approach with a mixture of wariness and curiosity, her dry lips moving as if trying to form words. "Shh," Margaret soothed, bringing a cup of water to the girl's mouth. "Do not try to speak yet. You need to save your strength." Morning Star drank gratefully, then sank back against the pillow with a small sigh. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on Margaret's face, studying her with an intensity that reminded her powerfully of Running Wolf. "Your father has gone hunting with my son," Margaret explained, not knowing how much English the girl understood. "He will return soon. For now, I need to change your bandages and check your wound." She worked carefully, removing the soiled cloths and examining the injury beneath. To her relief, the angry red lines seemed slightly less pronounced than they had been the night before. The infection was still present, but it was no longer spreading. Margaret allowed herself a small measure of hope. "Your medicine is strong," Morning Star whispered, her voice barely audible. Margaret looked up in surprise. "You speak English?" "My father taught me," the girl replied, a ghost of pride crossing her pale features. "He said that to survive, we must understand both worlds." "Your father is a wise man," Margaret said, echoing her own words from the night before. Morning Star's eyes softened. "He is the greatest warrior of our people, and the loneliest man I have ever known." The statement caught Margaret off guard, and she found herself wanting to ask more, but Morning Star's eyes had already fluttered closed, exhaustion pulling her back toward the healing embrace of sleep. Margaret finished her work in silence, then covered the girl with an extra blanket, and retreated to prepare the rabbits for cooking. As she worked, her mind wandered to Running Wolf, and the contradictions he presented. A fierce warrior who spoke of peace, a devoted father willing to leave his daughter to save his people, a man who had lost his wife and carried that grief in the depths of his dark eyes like a secret wound. She found herself wondering what it would be like to know such a man truly, to see beyond the mask he wore, and understand the heart that beat beneath. The thought surprised her with its intensity, and she pushed it firmly aside. She was a widow, a mother, a woman struggling to survive on the frontier. She had no business entertaining thoughts about a Blackfoot warrior, no matter how compelling he might be. The hours passed slowly as Margaret busied herself with the endless tasks of frontier living. She cleaned the cabin, checked on Morning Star regularly, and prepared a hearty stew from the rabbits Running Wolf had provided. The familiar routines helped to calm her anxiety, but she could not stop herself from glancing out the window every few minutes, searching for any sign of Benjamin's return. It was late afternoon when she finally heard voices approaching the cabin. She rushed to the door and threw it open, relief flooding through her as she saw Benjamin walking beside Running Wolf, both of them carrying the carcass of a young deer between them. "Mama!" Benjamin called out, his face flushed with triumph and exertion. "We got one! I got one! Running Wolf showed me how to track it and where to aim, and I got it with one shot." Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes as she embraced her son, not caring that he was dirty and sweating, and smelled strongly of the forest. He was safe, he was proud, and he had taken another step toward becoming the man his father would have wanted him to be. "I am so proud of you," she whispered against his hair. "So very proud." Running Wolf stood apart, watching the reunion with an expression that Margaret could not quite read. When she looked up and met his eyes, he inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Your son has the makings of a true hunter," he said. "He learns quickly and does not complain. These are good qualities in a warrior." Benjamin beamed at the praise, standing a little taller under the weight of the deer carcass. "Running Wolf says that tomorrow he will teach me to set better snares, ones that the animals cannot escape. And he showed me which plants are safe to eat in the winter, and where to find water when the streams freeze over." Margaret listened as her son recounted the day's lessons with breathless enthusiasm, her heart swelling with gratitude toward the man who had given him this gift. Running Wolf had done more than teach Benjamin to hunt. He had given him confidence, purpose, and a connection to this wild land that would serve him for the rest of his life. "Come inside," she said when Benjamin finally paused for breath. "Both of you. I have prepared supper and there is news about Morning Star." Running Wolf's expression sharpened instantly at the mention of his daughter, and he followed Margaret into the cabin without hesitation. When he saw Morning Star sitting propped up against the pillows, awake and alert, a transformation came over his stern features. The warrior melted away, replaced by a father whose love blazed in his dark eyes like a fire. He went to her side and knelt, taking her small hand in his much larger one. They spoke quietly in their native tongue, the musical cadence of their language filling the small cabin with sounds that Margaret found strangely beautiful. Morning Star smiled weakly at her father, and even in her weakened state, the resemblance between them was striking. "She says the white woman has healing hands," Running Wolf translated, looking up at Margaret with something new in his eyes. "She says that she dreamed of her mother last night, and her mother told her that she would live." Margaret felt a flush creep up her cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. "The infection is receding. If we continue the treatments and she rests properly, I believe she will make a full recovery." Running Wolf rose to his full height, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the cramped cabin, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Margaret was acutely aware of his physical presence, the breadth of his shoulders, the power coiled in his frame, the way he seemed to fill the entire space with his commanding aura. "You have done more than honor our agreement," he said, his voice low and rough. "You have saved my daughter's life. This is a debt that cannot be repaid with hunting lessons and meat." "I told you before," Margaret replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "I do not require payment for doing what is right." "And yet you shall have it," Running Wolf said. "The Blackfoot do not forget kindness. You and your son are under my protection now. If any harm comes to you, my people will avenge it as they would avenge their own blood." The weight of his words settled over Margaret like a physical thing, both comforting and terrifying in its implications. She opened her mouth to respond, but Benjamin chose that moment to burst into the cabin carrying the butchered deer meat, breaking the spell that had held them frozen. The evening meal was a strange but surprisingly pleasant affair. Running Wolf sat at the small table like a visiting dignitary, his manner formal but not unfriendly. Morning Star had been helped to a chair and was able to eat a small amount of broth, her appetite returning along with her strength. Benjamin peppered Running Wolf with questions about Blackfoot customs and hunting techniques, and the warrior answered with patience and even occasional humor. Margaret watched the scene with wonder, marveling at how quickly the boundaries between their worlds seemed to be dissolving. Just yesterday, she would have viewed this man as a potential threat, a dangerous savage to be feared and avoided. Now, sitting at her table and sharing her food, he seemed almost like family. As the night deepened and the fire burned low, Running Wolf rose to leave. He would spend another night in the forest, he explained, watching over the cabin while his daughter healed. It was not proper for a man to sleep under the same roof as a woman who was not his wife, and he would not bring dishonor upon Margaret by violating this custom. She walked him to the door, acutely aware of Benjamin and Morning Star watching them from across the room. The night air was cold against her face, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of the winter to come. "Running Wolf," she said quietly, stopping him before he could disappear into the darkness. "Thank you for what you are doing for my son, for watching over us, for everything." He turned to face her, and in the moonlight his features seemed carved from stone, beautiful and remote and utterly mysterious. "It is I who should thank you, Margaret Whitmore. You have shown me that not all white people are as I believe them to be. You have reminded me that kindness knows no tribe or nation." He reached out, and for a single breathless moment, his fingertips brushed against her cheek. The touch was brief, barely more than a whisper of contact, but it sent a shock through Margaret's entire body. "Sleep well," he said, and then he was gone, melting into the shadows as if he had never been there at all. Margaret stood in the doorway for a long time, her hand pressed against the cheek he had touched, her heart racing with emotions she did not dare to name. Behind her, she could hear Benjamin chattering excitedly to Morning Star about the day's hunt, their young voices mingling in a harmony that spoke of friendship and understanding. The next several days fell into a rhythm that Margaret would later remember as one of the most peaceful periods of her frontier life. Each morning, Running Wolf would appear at dawn to take Benjamin hunting, returning in the late afternoon with fresh game and new lessons learned. Each evening they would share a meal together, the conversation flowing more easily as the barriers between them continued to crumble. Morning Star improved rapidly under Margaret's care, her youth and strength asserting themselves against the infection that had nearly claimed her life. By the 5th day, she was able to walk short distances, and by the 7th, she was helping Margaret with simple chores around the cabin. The girl proved to be a delightful companion, bright and curious and eager to learn about the white woman's ways. Margaret taught her to make bread and preserve meat, while Morning Star shared her knowledge of native plants and their medicinal uses. They worked together in a companionable silence that sometimes gave way to deep conversations about life, love, and the challenges of being a woman in a world dominated by men. It was during one such conversation that Morning Star revealed something that would change everything. "My father speaks of you often," the girl said, her dark eyes twinkling with mischief. "He says that you are the strongest woman he has ever known, stronger even than my mother." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "Your father is too kind." "No," Morning Star said seriously. "My father never says things he does not mean. He respects you, Margaret. And more than that, I think he—" She trailed off, biting her lip as if she had said too much. "He what?" Margaret prompted, her heart suddenly pounding. Morning Star studied her for a long moment, then smiled. "He looks at you the way he used to look at my mother. I was very young when she died, but I remember that look. I thought I would never see it again." Margaret did not know how to respond. The girl's words had confirmed something that she had been trying desperately to deny, the growing attraction between herself and Running Wolf, an attraction that defied logic and propriety, and everything she had been taught about the differences between their peoples. Before she could formulate a response, the cabin door burst open, and Benjamin rushed in, his face pale with fear. "Mama, Running Wolf sent me back. There are men coming, white men on horses. He said they are dangerous and that we need to hide." Margaret's blood ran cold. She had heard stories about the gangs of outlaws who roamed the frontier, preying on isolated homesteads and leaving destruction in their wake. She had always believed that their remote location would protect them, but it seemed that belief had been naive. "How many?" she demanded, already moving toward the rifle. "6, maybe 7, Benjamin said. "Running Wolf is going to try to lead them away from the cabin, but he told me to protect you and Morning Star, if they come here." Margaret's mind raced as she assessed their situation. The cabin was defensible, with thick walls and small windows that could serve as firing positions, but against 6 or 7 armed men, their chances were slim. "Help me barricade the door," she ordered, her voice steady despite her fear. "Morning Star, get to the back of the cabin and stay down. Benjamin, load your rifle and take position at the east window. If anyone tries to come through, you shoot them. Do you understand?" Benjamin nodded, his young face set with determination. He was not a boy anymore, Margaret realized. He was becoming a man, and this moment would test that manhood in ways that neither of them could have anticipated. They worked quickly, pushing the heavy table against the door and positioning themselves at strategic points around the cabin. The waiting was the worst part, each second stretching into an eternity, as they strained to hear any sound from outside. When the gunshots finally came, they seemed to echo from everywhere at once. The gunshots tore through the stillness of the afternoon like thunderclaps, each report sending a fresh wave of terror through Margaret's heart. She pressed herself against the wall beside the window, her rifle clutched tightly in her hands, her eyes straining to see through the narrow gap in the shutters. Outside, the peaceful clearing around the cabin had transformed into a battlefield. She could see horses milling about near the tree line, their riders dismounted and taking cover behind rocks and fallen logs. And there, moving through the forest like a ghost, was Running Wolf, his bow singing as he loosed arrow after arrow at the attackers. "He is drawing them away from us," Margaret breathed, watching as one of the outlaws fell with an arrow protruding from his shoulder. "He is using himself as bait." Benjamin was at the other window, his young face pale but determined. "There are 5 of them still standing, Mama. Running Wolf cannot fight them all alone." Margaret knew her son was right. As skilled as Running Wolf was, he was one man against 5 armed outlaws, men who had nothing to lose and everything to gain by eliminating any witnesses to their presence. Sooner or later they would either kill him or drive him off, and then they would turn their attention to the cabin. She made her decision in an instant. "Benjamin, stay here and protect Morning Star. Do not open that door for anyone except me or Running Wolf. Do you understand?" "Mama, no," Benjamin protested, his voice cracking with fear. "You cannot go out there." "I must," Margaret replied, her voice firm despite the terror that threatened to overwhelm her. "Running Wolf saved your life by teaching you to hunt. He saved Morning Star's life by bringing her to me. Now it is my turn to save his." She did not wait for her son's response. She slipped out through the back window of the cabin, dropping silently to the ground and pressing herself against the rough wooden wall. From this angle she could see 2 of the outlaws clearly, both focused on the tree line where Running Wolf was making his stand. Margaret had never killed a man before. She had hunted deer and rabbits, had put down injured animals with a clean shot, but taking a human life was something entirely different. Yet as she raised her rifle and sighted along the barrel, she found that her hands were steady and her resolve was absolute. These men had come to her home with violence in their hearts. They would harm her son, her guest, and the man who had become something more than a friend. She would not allow that to happen. The first shot caught the nearest outlaw square in the chest, sending him sprawling backward into the dirt. The second outlaw spun toward her, his pistol rising, but Margaret was already working the lever of her rifle. Her second shot went wide, splintering the bark of a tree inches from the man's head, but it was enough to send him diving for cover. "There is a woman," the outlaw shouted to his companions. "In the cabin, she has a rifle." The dynamics of the fight shifted instantly. 2 of the remaining outlaws broke away from their pursuit of Running Wolf and began advancing toward the cabin, using the terrain for cover as they moved. Margaret fired again, forcing them to duck, but she knew that her ammunition was limited and her position was exposed. Then Running Wolf was there, emerging from the forest like an avenging spirit. He had abandoned his bow in favor of a tomahawk, and he fell upon the distracted outlaws with a fury that was terrifying to behold. His first strike felled a man before he could even turn around, and his second sent another screaming to the ground with a wound that would prove mortal. The 2 outlaws advancing on Margaret hesitated, caught between the warrior behind them and the armed woman before them. In that moment of indecision, Margaret made her move. She broke from cover and sprinted toward a large boulder that would give her a better firing position, her skirts tangling around her legs as she ran. She almost made it. The bullet caught her in the left arm, spinning her around and sending her crashing to the ground. Pain exploded through her body, white-hot and blinding, and for a moment she could not think, could not breathe, could not do anything but lie there in the dirt and stare up at the sky. Then Running Wolf's face appeared above her, his dark eyes blazing with an emotion she had never seen before. He scooped her up in his arms as if she weighed nothing, and carried her toward the cabin, his body shielding hers from any further attack. "The outlaws," Margaret gasped, fighting against the darkness that threatened to claim her. "There are still more of them." "They are dead," Running Wolf replied, his voice rough with something that might have been fear. "Or they have fled. You are safe now, Margaret. I will not let anyone harm you." The next hours passed in a haze of pain and confusion. Margaret was dimly aware of being laid on her own bed, of hands cutting away her sleeve to reveal the wound beneath, of voices speaking in urgent tones above her head. She tried to focus to understand what was happening, but the pain kept pulling her back into the darkness. When she finally surfaced into full consciousness, the cabin was quiet, and the light coming through the windows was the soft gold of early evening. She turned her head and found Running Wolf sitting beside her bed, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. "You are awake," he said, and she heard the relief in his voice like a physical thing. "I was afraid I had lost you." Margaret tried to sit up, but a gentle hand on her shoulder pressed her back down. "Do not move. The bullet passed through cleanly, but you have lost much blood. You need to rest." "Benjamin," she whispered, suddenly terrified. "Morning Star. Are they safe?" "They are safe," Running Wolf assured her. "Your son is a brave warrior. He protected my daughter as fiercely as any man could have done. They are both sleeping now, exhausted but unharmed." Margaret closed her eyes, letting the relief wash over her. They had survived. Against all odds, they had faced the violence of the frontier and emerged victorious. But at what cost? "The outlaws," she said, opening her eyes again. "How many were there? How many did we kill?" Running Wolf's expression hardened. "There were 7 in total. 5 are dead. 2 fled into the mountains, wounded and unlikely to survive the cold. They will not trouble you again." Margaret absorbed this information slowly, trying to reconcile the brutal reality of what had happened with the peaceful life she had tried to build on the frontier. She had killed a man today, perhaps 2. She had taken human lives to protect those she loved. The weight of that knowledge settled over her like a heavy blanket, and she was not sure she would ever be free of it. "You saved my life," Running Wolf said quietly, breaking into her thoughts. "When you came out of the cabin and fired on those men, you saved my life. Why did you do that?" Margaret met his eyes, seeing in their depths a vulnerability that surprised her. This fierce warrior, this leader of men, was asking her a question to which he genuinely did not know the answer. And in that moment, she realized that she could no longer hide from the truth that had been growing between them. "Because I could not bear to lose you," she whispered. "Because in these few short days, you have become something more to me than a stranger or an ally. You have become someone I care about, deeply and truly, and I would rather die than watch you fall while I did nothing." Running Wolf was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as if looking for any sign of deception. Then slowly, he reached out and took her uninjured hand in his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture of profound tenderness. "Among my people," he said, his voice low and rough with emotion, "when a man and woman save each other's lives, they are said to be bound by a sacred bond, a bond that transcends tribe and nation, and all the boundaries that separate us." Margaret felt her heart racing, not from fear this time, but from something else entirely. "What kind of bond?" Running Wolf raised her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "The bond of 2 souls who have recognized each other. The bond that my wife and I once shared and that I thought I would never find again." He paused, his eyes never leaving hers. "I did not come to your cabin seeking anything but help for my daughter. But I have found something far more precious. I have found you, Margaret Whitmore, and I do not want to lose you." Tears spilled down Margaret's cheeks, tears of pain and relief and joy, and 100 other emotions she could not name. "I am a white woman," she said, voicing the objection that hung between them like a specter. "You are a Blackfoot warrior. Our peoples have been enemies for generations. How can we possibly find a way to be together?" Running Wolf smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, his smile reached his eyes, transforming his stern features into something almost beautiful. "My people have a saying. The river does not ask permission to flow around the mountain. It simply finds its way. We will find our way too, Margaret, if you are willing to try." "I am willing," she breathed, and the words felt like a vow, sacred and unbreakable. "I am more than willing." He leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of intimacy that felt more profound than any kiss. They stayed that way for a long moment, breathing each other's air, feeling the connection between them solidify into something real and lasting. The days that followed were difficult but filled with an unexpected sweetness. Margaret's wound healed slowly, requiring her to rely on Benjamin and Morning Star for many of the tasks she normally handled herself. But she found that she did not mind the forced rest, not when it gave her more time to spend with Running Wolf, who had abandoned any pretense of sleeping in the forest and now spent his nights on a pallet by the fire. They talked for hours, sharing stories of their lives, their losses, their hopes for the future. Margaret learned about Running Wolf's childhood, about the father who had trained him to be a warrior, and the mother who had taught him to respect all living things. She learned about his wife, Dancing Feather, who had died bringing Morning Star into the world, and about the years of grief that had followed her death. In turn, she told him about Thomas, about the life they had built together and the dreams they had shared for Benjamin's future. She told him about her family in Boston, about the comfortable life she had left behind to follow her husband into the wilderness, and she told him about the loneliness that had consumed her after Thomas's death, a loneliness that had only begun to lift when Running Wolf walked out of the darkness and into her life. Benjamin and Morning Star, meanwhile, had become fast friends. They spent their days exploring the area around the cabin, with Morning Star teaching Benjamin the ways of her people, and Benjamin showing her the games and stories he had learned back east. Watching them together, Margaret felt a surge of hope for the future, a belief that perhaps the hatred between their peoples was not as inevitable as she had always been told. But she also knew that their idyllic isolation could not last forever. Running Wolf's tribe would be expecting his return, and the decision about what to do next could not be postponed indefinitely. It was Morning Star who finally forced the issue, cornering her father one evening after supper with a directness that reminded Margaret strongly of herself. "You love her, do you not?" the girl demanded, her dark eyes flashing with a mixture of challenge and hope. "Margaret, you love her." Running Wolf glanced at Margaret, who was sitting by the fire pretending not to listen, then back at his daughter. "I do," he admitted quietly. "I love her more than I thought it was possible to love again." Morning Star nodded, as if this confirmed something she had already known. "Then what are you going to do about it? Our people expect us to return. They will not understand if you bring a white woman back to our camp. There will be those who call you a traitor, who say that you have betrayed your own blood." "I know," Running Wolf said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision he faced. "But I also know that I cannot simply walk away from Margaret and Benjamin. They have become part of my heart. To leave them would be to leave a piece of my own soul behind." Margaret rose from her chair and crossed the room to stand beside him, her hand finding his in a gesture that had become natural and necessary. "Whatever you decide," she said, "I will support you. But I want you to know that I am not afraid of your people's judgment. I am not afraid of anything anymore, not as long as we are together." Running Wolf looked down at her, his dark eyes shining with an emotion that needed no translation. "You are the bravest woman I have ever known," he said, "and you have given me the courage to be brave as well." He turned to face Benjamin and Morning Star, who were watching the exchange with varying degrees of anxiety and excitement. "There is a place," he said slowly, "high in the mountains, where my people do not go. It is sacred ground, said to be protected by the spirits of our ancestors. Long ago it was a place of peace, where enemies could meet and talk without fear of violence." Margaret felt her heart quicken. "What are you saying?" Running Wolf squeezed her hand. "I am saying that perhaps we do not need to choose between our peoples. Perhaps we can create something new, a home that belongs to neither the Blackfoot nor the white settlers, but to us alone. A place where our children can grow up free of the hatred and suspicion that divides our worlds." The audacity of the idea took Margaret's breath away. To carve out a new life in the wilderness, separate from both their communities, would require courage, sacrifice, and an unwavering faith in each other. But as she looked into Running Wolf's eyes, she saw that he believed it was possible. And in that moment, she believed it too. "When do we leave?" she asked. Running Wolf smiled, that rare, beautiful smile that transformed his entire face. "As soon as you are strong enough to travel. We will build a new cabin, larger than this one, with room for all of us. Benjamin will continue to learn the ways of the hunter, and Morning Star will teach him our language and customs. And you and I will grow old together, watching our family flourish in this land that belongs to no one and everyone." Benjamin stepped forward, his young face alight with excitement. "I want to go," he said firmly. "I want to learn everything Running Wolf can teach me, and I want Morning Star to be my sister." Morningstar blushed at this proclamation but did not disagree. Instead, she moved to stand beside Benjamin, the two of them presenting a united front that made Margaret's heart swell with love and pride. "Then it is decided," Running Wolf declared. "We will leave within the week, before the first heavy snows make travel impossible. We will take what we need from this cabin and build our new life in the mountains." That night, after Benjamin and Morningstar had fallen asleep, Margaret and Running Wolf sat together by the fire, their hands intertwined, their hearts full of hope and anticipation. The future stretched before them, uncertain but bright with possibility. "I never thought I would feel this way again," Margaret whispered, leaning her head against his shoulder. "After Thomas died, I believed that part of my life was over. I thought I would spend the rest of my days alone, just surviving from one winter to the next." Running Wolf pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And I believed that my heart had died with Dancing Feather. I thought I would live only for Morning Star, for my duty to my people. I never imagined that I would find love again, least of all with a white woman who defied everything I thought I knew about her kind." "We were both wrong," Margaret said, tilting her face up to look at him. "We were both wrong," he agreed, "and I have never been happier to be proven mistaken." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their commitment to each other, a promise without words that spoke of love, trust, and the courage to build a future together against all odds. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the first flakes of winter snow, but inside the cabin there was only warmth and hope, and the beginning of a new chapter in their lives. The frontier had taken much from Margaret Whitmore, her husband, her comfortable life, her sense of security in a predictable world, but it had also given her something precious beyond measure. It had given her a second chance at love, a family forged not by blood but by choice, and the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As she fell asleep in Running Wolf's arms, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, Margaret knew that she had finally found her true home. Not in a cabin or a settlement or a distant city, but in the embrace of this man who had walked out of the darkness and into her heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome, but tonight there was only peace, only love, only the quiet certainty that together they could face anything. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, the sky a brilliant expanse of pale blue unmarred by clouds. Margaret stood in the doorway of the cabin that had been her home for 3 years, her heart heavy with the weight of leaving, but light with the promise of what lay ahead. Behind her, Running Wolf and Benjamin were loading the last of their supplies onto the travois that would carry their belongings into the mountains. She touched the wooden pendant that hung around her neck, the one Running Wolf had given her that first night when he had placed his daughter's life in her hands. It had become a talisman of sorts, a reminder of how much had changed in such a short time. She was not the same woman who had stood in this doorway just weeks ago, rifle raised against the unknown. She had been transformed by love, by loss, by the discovery that the boundaries between peoples were far more permeable than she had ever imagined. "Mama," Benjamin called from across the clearing, "we are almost ready. Running Wolf says we should leave soon if we want to reach the first camp before dark." Margaret took one last look at the cabin, at the small garden where she had planted vegetables each spring, at the stable where Bessie the mare stood waiting patiently to begin her journey, at the grave marker on the small hill where Thomas lay buried. She whispered a silent goodbye to her first husband, thanking him for the years they had shared, and asking for his blessing on the new life she was about to begin. Then she turned her back on the past and walked toward her future. The journey into the mountains was arduous but exhilarating. Running Wolf led them along paths that Margaret would never have found on her own, trails known only to the Blackfoot and the animals that roamed these wild lands. He moved with the confidence of a man who knew every rock, every tree, every twist and turn of the terrain, and Margaret found herself marveling once again at the depth of his connection to this wilderness. Morning Star walked beside Margaret for much of the journey, the girl's strength having returned fully in the days since her illness. She chattered happily about the sacred place they were going, describing the crystal-clear lake that lay at its center, the meadows that bloomed with wildflowers in summer, the caves that provided shelter from the harshest storms. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about this place," Morning Star said, her dark eyes shining with excitement. She said that long ago, before the white men came, it was a gathering place for all the tribes. Enemies would put aside their weapons and come together to trade, to share stories, to celebrate the gifts of the earth. She said that the spirits of our ancestors still watch over it, protecting it from those who would bring violence to its shores. Margaret listened with fascination, trying to imagine what such a place must look like. Do your people still go there? Morning Star shook her head. Not for many generations. After the wars began, the old ways were forgotten. My father says that we have lost much of what made us great, that we have become so focused on fighting our enemies, that we have forgotten how to live in peace with the land and with each other. Margaret glanced ahead at Running Wolf, who was deep in conversation with Benjamin about tracking and survival skills. Your father is a wise man. I hope that what we are doing will help to restore some of what has been lost. I believe it will, Morning Star said with quiet conviction. My father has changed since he met you, Margaret. He laughs more. He speaks more freely about his feelings. He has hope again, hope that I have not seen in him since my mother died. The words touched Margaret deeply, and she reached out to squeeze the girl's hand. I am glad. Your father has given me hope as well. After my husband died, I thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, just surviving. Running Wolf has shown me that there is still room in my heart for love, for joy, for the possibility of a future that I never dared to imagine. They made camp that night in a small valley sheltered from the wind. The four of them gathered around a crackling fire as the stars emerged overhead. Running Wolf prepared a meal of dried meat and wild roots, his movements efficient and practiced, while Benjamin and Morning Star worked together to set up the sleeping areas. Margaret watched them all with a sense of wonder that bordered on disbelief. Just weeks ago, she had been a widow struggling to survive on the frontier, her only companion a son who was still more boy than man. Now she was part of something larger, a family bound not by blood but by choice, by the shared experience of danger and the mutual commitment to build a new life together. After supper, Running Wolf came to sit beside her, his shoulder pressing warmly against hers as they stared into the flames. The firelight danced across his strong features, highlighting the high cheekbones and the firm set of his jaw, the dark eyes that held depths she was only beginning to explore. What are you thinking? He asked quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackle of the fire. Margaret considered the question for a moment before answering. I am thinking about how strange life is, how the things we fear most often lead us to the things we need most. I feared you when you first appeared at my cabin. I feared what your presence might mean for my safety, for Benjamin's future, and now I cannot imagine my life without you in it. Running Wolf nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the flames. Among my people, we believe that every life follows a path that was set before we were born. We call it the Spirit Road, the journey that our souls must take to fulfill their purpose in this world. For many years, I thought my Spirit Road had ended with Dancing Feather's death. I thought I was simply waiting for the time when I could join her in the land beyond. He turned to look at Margaret, and in his dark eyes she saw a vulnerability that made her heart ache. But now I understand that my Spirit Road was leading me to you all along. Every loss, every hardship, every moment of despair was simply preparing me for this, for us. Margaret felt tears prick at her eyes, and she did not try to hide them. I love you, she whispered, the words coming easily now, naturally, as if she had been saying them all her life. I love you, Running Wolf, with all my heart, with everything I am, and everything I hope to become. He cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms warm against her cheeks. And I love you, Margaret Whitmore. You have given me back my life, my hope, my reason for being. Whatever challenges await us, we will face them together. This I swear to you on my honor as a warrior and a man. Their lips met in a kiss that seemed to last forever, a seal upon the promises they had made to each other. When they finally drew apart, Margaret saw that Benjamin and Morning Star were watching them from across the fire, their young faces split with identical grins of delight. Does this mean we are truly going to be a family? Benjamin asked, his voice trembling with barely contained excitement. Running Wolf smiled, that rare and beautiful smile that Margaret had come to treasure. It means exactly that, young hunter. From this day forward we are bound together by ties stronger than blood. You are my son, as surely as if I had fathered you myself, and Morning Star is your sister, as surely as if you had shared the same womb." Morning Star crossed to where Margaret sat and knelt before her, taking her hands with a solemnity that seemed beyond her years. "I have prayed for a mother," she said softly. "Ever since I was old enough to understand what I had lost, I have prayed for someone to fill that emptiness in my heart. You are the answer to those prayers, Margaret. I am honored to call you mother, if you will have me." Margaret pulled the girl into a fierce embrace, her tears flowing freely now. "I will have you," she promised. "I will have you as my daughter, and I will love you and protect you for all the days of my life." The remainder of the journey passed in a blur of happiness and anticipation. Each day brought them closer to their destination, and each night strengthened the bonds that held them together. By the time they finally crested the last ridge and looked down upon the sacred valley, they had become a family in every sense that mattered. The valley was even more beautiful than Morning Star had described. A pristine lake lay at its center, its waters so clear that Margaret could see the stones on the bottom even from this distance. Meadows carpeted with late autumn grass spread out from the lake's shores, bordered by stands of pine and aspen that blazed with color. To the east, a series of caves opened in the rock face, natural shelters that would protect them from the winter storms. And over it all hung a sense of peace, of timelessness, as if this place existed outside the troubles and conflicts of the world beyond. "It is perfect," Margaret breathed, reaching for Running Wolf's hand. "It is home," he replied simply. They descended into the valley as the sun began its westward journey, their hearts full of hope and their minds already planning the work that lay ahead. Running Wolf identified a level area near the caves where they would build their cabin, close enough to the water for convenience, but elevated enough to be safe from flooding. Benjamin immediately began exploring the surrounding area, his hunter's eyes already noting the tracks of deer and rabbit that crisscrossed the meadows. Morning Star gathered samples of the plants that grew along the lake's edge, identifying which ones could be used for food, medicine, and dye. The first weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Running Wolf and Benjamin worked from dawn until dusk, felling trees and shaping logs for the cabin, their muscles straining against the weight of their labors, but their spirits buoyed by the knowledge of what they were building. Margaret and Morning Star prepared the campsite, preserved food for the coming winter, and began the countless tasks that would transform this wild place into a home. As the walls of the cabin rose and the first snows began to dust the mountain peaks, Margaret found herself marveling at how far they had come. The frontier had tested her in ways she could never have imagined, stripping away everything she thought she knew about herself, and revealing a strength she had not known she possessed. But it had also given her gifts beyond measure, a son who was becoming a man, a daughter who had healed the wound in her heart, and a love that transcended the boundaries of culture, race, and expectation. The cabin was completed just as winter settled over the valley in earnest. It was larger than the one Margaret had left behind, with a main room dominated by a massive stone fireplace, 2 sleeping alcoves divided by heavy curtains, and a storage area stocked with enough food and supplies to last until spring. Running Wolf had carved intricate designs into the doorframe, symbols from his people's tradition that invoked protection and prosperity. Margaret had hung curtains in the windows, stitched from fabric she had brought from the old homestead, adding a touch of softness to the rugged interior. On the night of the first heavy snowfall, they gathered around the fire as a family, the wind howling outside but unable to penetrate the warmth and security they had created together. Running Wolf told stories of his ancestors, of the great chiefs and warriors who had shaped the Blackfoot nation, of the traditions and beliefs that had sustained his people through generations of hardship. Margaret shared tales of her own heritage, of the pilgrims who had crossed an ocean in search of freedom, of the revolution that had birthed a nation, of the pioneers who had pushed ever westward in pursuit of dreams. Benjamin and Morning Star listened with rapt attention, absorbing the stories of both their peoples and finding in them the threads of a shared humanity that transcended their differences. They were the living embodiment of what Margaret and Running Wolf had dared to create, a bridge between 2 worlds that had been at war for too long. When the stories were done and the fire had burned low, Running Wolf rose and took Margaret's hands in his, pulling her gently to her feet. His dark eyes were serious but filled with a tenderness that made her heart flutter like a girl's. "Margaret Whitmore," he said, his voice resonant with emotion, "I have waited long enough to ask you what my heart has known since the moment I saw you standing in the moonlight with your rifle raised, ready to defend your home against whatever threat the night might bring." Margaret felt her breath catch in her throat. "What is your question?" Running Wolf reached into his vest and withdrew a small object that glinted in the firelight. It was a ring, simply made but beautiful, crafted from silver and set with a small turquoise stone that gleamed like a piece of captured sky. "This ring belonged to my mother," he said. "She gave it to me when I became a man, telling me to save it for the woman who would share my life's journey. I gave it to Dancing Feather on the day we were joined, and she wore it until the day she died. I have kept it close to my heart ever since, waiting for the time when I might find someone worthy of its meaning." He sank to one knee before her, the warrior humbling himself in a gesture that spoke louder than any words. "Margaret, will you be my wife? Will you join your life to mine, your spirit to my spirit, your future to my future? Will you stand beside me through whatever joys and sorrows await us, until the sun falls from the sky and the rivers cease to flow?" Tears streamed down Margaret's face as she looked at the man who had transformed her life, the man who had shown her that love knew no boundaries, and that home was not a place, but a feeling of belonging. She heard Benjamin and Morning Star holding their breath behind her, waiting for her answer with the same anticipation that thrummed through her own veins. "Yes," she whispered, and then, stronger, "Yes, Running Wolf, I will be your wife. I will be your partner, your companion, your love. From this day forward, wherever you go, I will go. Whatever you face, I will face beside you. This is my promise, my vow, my sacred oath." Running Wolf slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if it had been made for her hand alone. Then he rose and took her in his arms, kissing her with a passion that left no doubt about the depth of his feelings. Benjamin let out a whoop of joy, and Morning Star clapped her hands in delight. And for a moment the little cabin was filled with the sounds of celebration and love. They were married the next morning in a ceremony that blended the traditions of both their peoples. Running Wolf spoke the words of the Blackfoot joining ritual, invoking the spirits of the earth, the sky, the water, and the fire to witness their union. Margaret recited the vows she had learned in her childhood church, promising to love, honor, and cherish until death parted them. Benjamin and Morning Star served as witnesses, their young voices joining in the prayers and blessings that sealed the marriage. When it was done, they stood together on the shores of the frozen lake, 4 people from 2 worlds united by something far more powerful than blood or heritage. The winter sun cast long shadows across the snow, painting the valley in shades of gold and amber, and Margaret felt a peace settle over her soul that she had never known before. This was what Thomas had dreamed of when he had brought her to the frontier all those years ago. Not just a home in the wilderness, but a life filled with meaning and purpose, a family that extended beyond the narrow definitions she had been taught to accept. If he could see her now, she knew he would be proud. He would understand that her love for Running Wolf did not diminish what they had shared, but rather honored it by proving that her heart was still capable of growth, of change, of embracing the unexpected gifts that life offered. The years that followed were not always easy. There were harsh winters when the snow piled so deep that they could not leave the cabin for days at a time. There were moments of fear when strangers passed through the valley, forcing them to hide until the danger had passed. There were disagreements and misunderstandings, moments when the differences between their backgrounds seemed insurmountable. But there was also joy, abundant and sustaining. There was the pride of watching Benjamin grow into a skilled hunter and a wise young man, equally comfortable in both the Blackfoot and white traditions. There was the delight of seeing Morning Star blossom into a beautiful young woman, her heart eventually captured by a young trapper who saw past the color of her skin to the light that shone within. There was the profound contentment of sitting beside Running Wolf each evening, their hands intertwined, their hearts beating in rhythm with each other, and with the land that had become their sanctuary. And there was the miracle of new life, the son born to Margaret and Running Wolf in the 3rd year of their marriage, a child with his father's dark eyes and his mother's auburn hair, a living symbol of the bridge they had built between their worlds. They named him Thomas Wolfe Whitmore, honoring both the man who had made Margaret's journey possible and the heritage of the father who would raise him. On the night of young Thomas's birth, Running Wolf held his newborn son in his arms and looked at Margaret with an expression of wonder that mirrored what she felt in her own heart. The cabin was warm with firelight, filled with the presence of their family. Benjamin sat proudly by the fire, already planning the skills he would teach his new brother. Morning Star hummed a Blackfoot lullaby, her voice soft and sweet in the flickering shadows. "You have given me everything," Running Wolf said, his voice thick with emotion. "More than I ever dared to hope for. More than I deserve." Margaret reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines of the jaw she had come to know as well as her own. "We have given each other everything, and this is only the beginning." Outside, the mountains stood sentinel over their valley, ancient and eternal, witnesses to the small miracle that had unfolded within their embrace. The spirits of the land seemed to whisper their blessing on the wind, a promise that this family, born of courage and love, would endure. Margaret closed her eyes and let the peace wash over her. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the losses and fears, the unexpected turns that had led her to a destiny she could never have imagined. She thought of the man who had appeared out of the darkness with a wounded daughter and a desperate plea, and how that moment had changed everything. "Your son must hunt soon. My daughter hungers tonight." Those had been the words that had started it all, spoken by a stranger at her door on a cold autumn evening. She had not known then that she was standing at the threshold of a new life, that the choice she made in that moment would determine the course of her entire future. But she knew now. She knew that every step of her journey had led her exactly where she was meant to be, in the arms of the man she loved, surrounded by the family they had created together, at peace with the past and hopeful for the future. The frontier had given her more than she had ever dreamed possible. It had given her a home, a family, and a love that would last until the mountains crumbled to dust and the stars fell from the sky. And as she drifted off to sleep with her newborn son in her arms and her husband's heartbeat steady beneath her ear, Margaret Whitmore Running Wolf knew that she was exactly where she belonged. Their story had